Good morning and welcome back to Politico's Competitive Europe Summit. The US welcomed a new administration in the White House, and if there's any news to be taken from President Joe Biden's visit to Brussels earlier this month, it's that the transatlantic relationship is entering a new era. But what will this look like in terms of trade, technology and climate? We dive deep into this discussion on the topics I just mentioned with a panel of expert speakers. I would like to welcome in the room Executive Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis, responsible for trade. Good morning. And joining us virtually is Bernd Lange, who chairs the Parliament's Trade Committee. Good morning, Mr. Lange.
Hello, good morning.
And Anthony Gardner, former US Ambassador to the EU and Senior Advisor at Brunswick Group. Good morning.
Good morning.
Before we begin, I'd like to quickly remind you not to forget to submit questions via the Swepcard app in the question box next to the live stream. You can also tweet about this event with our hashtag Politico Competition. Good morning, and maybe we can start with the recent visit from President Biden to Brussels. It led to a ceasefire on the dispute over aircraft subsidies for Airbus and Boeing. Was this the beginning of a new era in the EU-US relationship?
Well, I would like to outline that from the EU side, we had been very actively working for the reset of EU-US relations, and already came with a policy paper how we can engage in different areas in December last year. We can say that the EU-US summit indeed was very successful and provided for this reset of relationship. One can also say that we are basically bringing our relations back to normal, because EU and US are strategic allies. We are like-minded partners. We are having a shared values. So it's only logical that we cooperate very closely. And indeed, it was a big success that we managed to ground the Airbus-Boeing dispute, which was the longest-running dispute in WTO history, and instead we created a cooperative framework in the area of large civil aircraft.
Mm-hmm. Of course, things aren't back to normal when it comes to the other files. The next big obstacle will be solving the steel and aluminium dispute that former President Donald Trump had installed. How are those talks going? Because there's a clear deadline for that one as well.
Indeed, already in May, together with U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai and Secretary of Commerce General Raimondo, we reached an agreement to solve this issue by the end of the year, actually by the 1st of December. This commitment was reiterated in the EU-US summit conclusions, and now we are working very intensively towards this. I would say things are on a positive track also towards resolving this dispute. Okay,
Mr. Lange, maybe on this issue, you already indicated that this pause on the retaliatory tariffs can only be temporary. Are you optimistic that a solution can be found?
Optimistic. Indeed, the talk with Katherine Tai I had was quite promising. Really looking to the developing of workers-orientated trade policy, and looking to the people perhaps left behind so far in trade policy, is also related to the steel conflict, because it is harming steel workers on both sides of the Atlantic. And we should really look for a solution which is in favor of securing working place on both sides of the Atlantic. And I'm quite confident that under this perspective, a solution might be possible. And I'm also convinced that the United States government is now looking for, let's say, a constructive approach to the European Union, look to the peace situation regarding Airbus and Boeing, and I'm quite confident that we will find a solution for the steel sector as well, so that this doubling of our retaliation measures is not necessary anymore.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Gardner, maybe I'd like to ask you to take a step back. If you take a look at this summit with Biden in Brussels, do you think it was a turning point for EU-US relationship post-Trump?
Well, first of all, I want to say how, what a pleasure it is to be back with the Executive Vice President, Valdis Dombrovskis, and MEP Bernd Lange. It reminds me of the old days when the U.S. and the EU were working together on a whole range of issues. That's the way it should be. So I would describe what happened as a return to normality. For 60 years on a bipartisan basis, the U.S. and the EU under both administrations really tried to move ahead on a wide variety of fronts. So to answer your question, I'm happy. I think the first 6 months, 5 months have been very good. When I compare with the papers, the policy papers we were writing during the Biden campaign and the proposals that we put forward, many of the things have actually come to fruition. Thanks to my fellow panelists, in part, Boeing, Airbus, and of course the tax agreement of the OECD, which we had written about and we proposed for. Of course, the 232 tariffs, I wish had never been imposed in the first place, but they're political realities. And I think the United States is looking for a way out that will preserve this administration's position in the midterm election, something that my fellow panelists know very well. But I'm very happy. I think we've made good progress. I'd like to see the Trade Technology Council now really move ahead as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. We'll get to that in a second, but maybe just on this turning point in the transatlantic relations, did a common enemy, China, help get the historic allies closer together?
Well, look, I wouldn't put it that way. I think the administration has been very clear that the U.S. is not pushing Europe to choose between one or the other, nor is it trying to decouple Europe or the United States from China, because, of course, that's pointless to do. But I do think that China is the acid test. Europe doesn't like those words, but I think it's the political reality, certainly in Congress, and I think among a lot of voters and probably a lot of people in the administration who will ask, what good are allies if they don't join with us in addressing the core issue? But no one's talking about an enemy here. Everyone is quite clear that there are areas where we can and we will cooperate with China on climate and in other areas.
Okay, thank you. Maybe, Mr. Dombrovskis, do you, when Mr. Gardner says Europe doesn't like those words, an acid test as China, how do you look at that?
First of all, during the US-EU summit, indeed, we discussed also a lot issues related to China, and also when you look, for example, on specifically Airbus-Boeing dispute, we set a framework how we'll cooperate between ourselves, but we also set a framework for potential competitors coming from non-market economies, and obviously having primarily China in mind in this. So it's clear that being a like-minded partners, we are willing to cooperate with US also on China, both bilaterally, but also in a trilateral EU-US-Japan format, and also through updating multilateral rules through the reform of the World Trade Organization, where we also see now much more engagement from US side than from the previous administration.
Mm-hmm. And in the Trade and Technology Council that was agreed upon during the summit to work together on joint standards, emerging technologies. Before we go into the details of this, was that also can that be seen as a pushback against China as well?
First of all, it's to maintain US and EU global leadership in new and emerging technologies. Mm-hmm. And once again, having many shared values. For example, when we discuss new technologies, including, for example, artificial intelligence, it's important that we preserve this human-centric approach based on democratic values. Also, if we cooperate in setting the standards, there are good chance of those standards becoming global standards. So there's lots of value for EU-US to cooperate in many areas of technology. So indeed, that was another positive deliverable from the summit, that we agreed to set up this Trade and Technology Council. Right now, we're already working towards concrete deliverables, which different working groups could prepare, and for an inaugural meeting of the Council itself.
Mm-hmm. And when if you speak of concrete deliverables, could you lay that out a little bit more? Because some fear that this will become a bureaucratic platform that might not lead too much.
Well, if you look at the outline of the Trade and Technology Council, of course it's visible that it's quite broad and covering a broad range of areas. So we agree that right now our teams are working and identifying priority areas, focusing on concrete deliverables. Indeed, so it's important that not only we, so to say, discuss those issues among ourselves, but concentrate on what can be delivered already in a short term to prove the usefulness of this format.
Mm-hmm. And this inaugural meeting, we can expect this?
Well, it's still work in progress, but it's being prepared.
Okay, maybe Mr. Lange, just to come back to you quickly on China. How do you see the U.S. approach on China and to get Brussels involved in that?
Of course, even we are strong allies and strong partners, we have also some differences, no doubt about. Looking to the economic relations with China, of course, we have more export interests than perhaps the United States, and the deficit is quite different to the United States than to Europe. So this is one element where we have some other tracks to go than the United States. Secondly, of course, I'm sure that, as our colleague Gardner just mentioned, that there are also some cooperative elements where China is needed in the WTO and the World Trade Organization in projects against climate change. So there are elements where we have to look for cooperation. But on the other side, indeed, there are also some clear confrontational elements. And if we are looking really serious on a worker-centered trade policy, then of course we have to look to a violation of labor rights and human rights in China as a competition advantage for China as well. And therefore we need really to have a toolbox unilateral from the European Union on illegal subsidies, on the procurement instrument, on value chain and the due diligence in value chain, but also some cooperative initiatives together with the United States on state-owned enterprises, on competitive neutrality. By the way, in my talks with Catherine Tai, we agreed that this company-oriented approach on supply chain and due diligence, like in the USMCA, but also in our coming legislation on due diligence, is a quite interesting approach, and perhaps there are also possibilities to work together also towards China in the interest of the people on the ground.
Yeah, and as an example of this cooperation, is the Trade and Technology Council a good idea?
I think yes. And as Mr. Gardner said, we had a lot of experience during the TTIP negotiation about things which are possible and things which are not possible. The question of aligning standards which were introduced a long time ago, perhaps this crash test for cars, is not possible because there are a lot of competitive elements in. But looking into the future, in the regulation for blockchain, for artificial intelligence, for new elements for the fight against climate change, there are a lot of opportunities to work together. So looking to the future, what is needed, I think this should be the role of the Tech Council.
Okay, Mr. Gardner, this brings back memories for you. But is there a risk it won't be as effective as some or the Commission might hope?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything that Bernd Lange said. We have experience with what worked and what didn't work. Indeed, in TTIP, we were too ambitious. And we've been through many similar organizations in the past, including the tech, which didn't really achieve what it was set out to achieve. So we shouldn't overload it. These are often technical issues. They will struggle to get high-level attention. Indeed, what the communique set forth is very ambitious and very broad, but I'm confident. And the organizing principles, I think, behind the work should be on both sides, and also informed our work during the campaign. how can we work together as allies to achieve more for our voters, in particular for the middle class, than we can do bilaterally, transactionally, as Donald Trump sought to do? Because if we fail to make that case to our voters, then both sides of the Atlantic will be faced with the increased risk of returning to demagogic populism. So we need to, put aside the differences in the past. There are going to be a lot of areas where, for example, the EU is simply too far advanced in its thinking. And it's not going to hold up the bus for the United States to suddenly say, well, we think you should change this or that. For 4 years, because of Donald Trump, the U.S. was absent and Europe was setting the rules for Silicon Valley. It's not blaming Europe, it's just stating the fact. So let's set aside the areas where we're just not going to be able to agree or the EU is too far away. I agree. Bernd Lange just mentioned a few areas where we're both struggling to set standards for the future. And Bernd mentioned artificial intelligence. I think that's one of them. Algorithmic auditing is a good example. We're also considering issues about data portability. On both sides of the Atlantic, we have legislation which is trying to get a grip on some core issues that address, for example, data or information asymmetry. The fact that some of the platforms know a lot more about how their machines work than voters and electors, legislators, and so forth. So let's focus on the areas where we can make quick progress.
And those can then be those concrete deliverables that the Commissioner mentioned. Do you see others when it comes to these Trade and Tech Council?
Sure. There are, of course, a lot of issues where I think we should be talking about policy, for example, supply chain resilience and diversification. I would very much like the TTC to consider a topic which has not really gotten enough attention, in my view, and that is how do we work together in international standard-setting organizations to prevent the Chinese from dominating those organizations, because that is their intent. It's set forth in their 2035 plan, and they've already appointed 2 critical heads of international organizations. And can we actually write the rules together? In the areas where we already have the rules, it's too hard to harmonize. But in the areas where we're needing to set rules for the future, I think we should be doing that. So those are 2 specific areas. And then there are also issues which are important about how we ensure that Europe and the United States remain competitive in key industries of the future like semiconductors.
Okay. Would you like to respond about, for example, the international standard setting, international organizations? Is that something that we should look into?
Indeed. When we were discussing Trade and Technology Council, international standard setting was actually one of the areas where we indeed intend to cooperate. And there, I think we share this view. Also, questions related to supply chain resilience, including, for example, in the area of semiconductors, where both EU and US are now, in a sense, conducting the review how supply chains are working in the areas of semiconductors, what needs to be to strengthen their resilience, to strengthen the manufacturing capacity of semiconductors. So those are indeed practical examples where we can make relatively quick progress.
Okay, and maybe to take a step back on the EU-US relationships, we mentioned Aircraft Boeing, the Trade and Technology Council. It was the first time, I think, that you met Catherine Tai. What was your impression overall of her and the administration that she represents on trade?
Well, as regards Catherine Tai, it was the first time we met physically, but we already had several bilateral video conferences before. I already mentioned one when we agreed to work to resolving the steel and aluminium dispute, but obviously also questions concerning the preparation of Airbus Boeing deal. So we had been engaging quite intensively also beforehand, and I would say that the first impression is very positive. We are cooperating very closely and very constructively. Okay.
And I assume you've also raised the WTO with her. The appellate body of the WTO is still in impasse. The US keeps saying in Geneva that there's not much to be done at this point. How do you see things moving forward there?
Well, as regards WTO, when we were presenting the new EU trade policy strategy, among other things, we presented a detailed proposal on the WTO reform affecting all 3 core functions of the WTO: negotiating, monitoring and deliberation, and obviously also appellate body. and we are, of course, very keen to engage with US and to see how we can unblock current situation. Well, US is currently looking at this. They are sending a signal that they are willing to cooperate in this area, but they still need some time to work out their approach towards WTO reform. But I'm confident that in a due course we'll be able to engage positively also on this. And already now we discussed that we need to cooperate closely towards the next WTO ministerial conference, MC12, to ensure that it's a success.
And are you not becoming impatient with the US approach on WTO? Because as long as they don't make up their mind, the system is still blocked?
Clearly we would need to make progress, but it's understandable that the new U.S. administration needs some time to, work out different policy areas. We're already making good progress in a number of areas, notably on our bilateral agenda. We are expecting that the U.S. administration needs a bit more time also to work out their approach as regards WTO reform.
Okay, step by step. And before I go back to the gentleman, maybe one more thing on WTO. You mentioned the ministerial conference. What do you expect of it? Because it will be seen as a key test of can the multilateral trading system post-pandemic still deliver?
Indeed, from the EU side, we already came with a number of initiatives where we would like to see some progress, including in trade and health, trade and climate. Right now, there are negotiations ongoing on fisheries subsidies. Hopefully, we can conclude by MC12. And another important deliverable we see from MC12 is setting up a WTO working group on the WTO reform.
Yeah. Mr. Gardner, maybe you can give us some insight on the US approach, because, like I said, some in Geneva and Brussels are becoming impatient. Why? And maybe Mr. Langen is one of those impatient people. Why is it taking so long for them to decide on what to do with the World Trade Organization?
Look, I can't speculate on that, but I mean, part of it may be related to the fact that not all the relevant people are yet confirmed. Some are nominated but not confirmed. Part of it's that, and part of it, this is very sensitive politically, and we can all read what the campaign said during the run up to the elections in terms of free trade agreements not being a priority for the administration. Look, I think they want to solve this issue. The question is when and how. So it'll be related to how exactly the WTO is going to be reformed. When I read the white paper from the EU, I think there's a lot in there that we would agree with. So I'm assuming this will be sorted out, but it's just a delay, as the Executive Vice President said.
Okay, Mr. Lange, are you one of those impatient people?
Of course, I'm from the north of Germany, and my people here have a lot of patience. So sometimes it's also limited, but in this case, I totally understand the development in the United States. So they have to nominate, for example, an ambassador for Geneva. This is not done yet. And of course, in my talk with Catherine Tai, we agreed that this institution, WTO, has to be modernized. It's really slow, and there is a more or less stillstand in the development for years. So we need really a success in the MC12, and we have to really investigate quite intensively what items should be on the agenda of MC12. So the question of trade and health, indeed, as Mr. Dombrovskis mentioned. And then, of course, we can start the appellate body reform process as well. But look, if we are really honest with the worker-centered trade policy, then of course we have to reflect also in the ongoing negotiation. And I appreciate very much the proposal by the United States in the discussion about illegal subsidies for fishery, that we look also into the question of the situation of workers and forced labor. So there is a change. And of course, I guess indeed the United States are not totally ready to give all the emphasis they have into this reform process, but we should really work together to bring this body to more lively results. And of course, one of the big positive elements of the new US government is the unblocking of the appointment of the new Director General in WTO. And I guess Catherine Tai and the new DIG are really able to give a new momentum to WTO. And I hope the European Union will support this.
Maybe to pick up on one thing that you mentioned, and just to recap for most who haven't followed this closely. So the WTO is currently negotiating the fisheries subsidies to end overfishing, and the US recently proposed to ban forced labor on fishing ships. It has come fairly late with this proposal because the negotiations are trying to reach an end game. How do you look at this proposal?
Well, as Mr. Lange said, from the EU side, we are positive about this proposal. We are ready to engage and to work on this. And in any case, we think it's important to finalize those negotiations, to reach agreement by the next ministerial conference, because that would be, in a sense, first agreement concluded under the new Director General of the WTO, showing that there is indeed a new momentum in the WTO and ability actually to conclude negotiations.
And so you think it's realistic, this proposal?
Well, we are ready to engage constructively from the EU side. Of course, it requires agreement from the broader WTO membership, but we are willing to cooperate with the US and, in case, willing to work towards successful conclusion of those negotiations.
Okay. Thank you. Before I touch on the last topic, just a quick reminder that you can still ask questions through our Swapcard app that I would happy to take to our speakers. The Commission will soon propose its Fit for 55 package, of which the carbon border adjustment mechanism is a part. Maybe Mr. Langenijs, I'll start with you. Why is this so important, and how do you think it will impact the EU's relationship with the US?
It's a big question, and I have to be short, I guess. So, of course, we have to really try to convince our trading partner also to go for a climate neutral system in 2050. And to give some incentives, the discussion about this carbon border adjustment mechanism is there. But of course, this has to be WTO compatible, so no discrimination. It has also clear that we have to have a system which is built in our legal system as well. And thirdly, it has to be effective. So because of the system should be really a reduction of CO2 inside the European Union and outside the European Union achieved. And fourthly, we have to really talk to our trading partners so that they are not having in mind, oh, the European Unions are now building up a new protective system. And of course, we have to be clear that other measures regarding the CO2 reduction are also equivalent to this carbon border adjustment mechanism. And this is the ongoing discussion with the United States. It's clear at the moment that there will be no carbon border adjustment mechanism in the United States. Even it's unlikely that there will be a CO2 price quite soon. And we have to agree on really equivalent measures. Otherwise, of course, this might be a new source for a trade war. Similar, by the way, with other major trading partners, we have to look to an understanding so that this CBAM will not land at a WTO case. And this is a big task for the next month.
Okay. Mr. Gardner, how do you think this will be perceived around the world and particularly in Washington?
Well, perceived negatively in China and some other countries in Russia, but in the United States, look, we all seen some of the concerns that were raised by this administration. I hope it doesn't lead to the frictions that we've just heard about. That's the last thing we need right now is to have a WTO dispute about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Look, if it's WTO compliant, we can agree on the principles. I can understand why Europe doesn't want carbon leakage and industries to shift out of Europe to places where they can pollute more freely. I mean, that I think is completely understandable. We probably won't have a similar system, but I just simply hope that we can agree on equivalent measures and avoid a trade dispute. The focus needs to be on China. And my earnest desire is that we not only clean up the wreckage from the past during the 4 years of Donald Trump, but avoid unnecessary disputes of this kind for the future.
Okay. And if you say the focus should be on China, does this also apply to this file? I mean, is this something that maybe you think the US and the EU should do together instead of the EU alone?
It would be nice if we could, indeed.
But it's not going to happen soon, probably. What can we expect of the proposal? It's coming fairly soon. Can you give us a little bit more insight?
Indeed. In European Commission, we are now preparing this carbon border adjustment mechanism proposal. It's going to be part of the broader so-called Fit for 55 package, which will be a package of measures how EU will reach its emission reduction target by 55% by 2030. Obviously, as we are moving towards this ambitious emission reduction target and eventually to carbon neutrality by 2050, it's one element that we cannot continue with free emission allocations to energy-intensive industry. So we need to start phasing out those allocations. But for this, we need to address the problem of carbon leakage, and that's where the carbon border adjustment mechanism comes in. So adjusting the price difference, so to say, at the border for those third countries which have less strict environmental emission legislation. And as previous speakers already said, the WTO compatibility of the proposal is a prerequisite. So we're paying lots of attention to this. And for this, basically, the key issues are non-discrimination. So we cannot discriminate against among third countries or third countries vis-a-vis EU producers, and avoidance of so-called double protection. So we cannot have both free allocations of emissions and carbon border adjustment mechanism. When we are phasing in carbon border adjustment mechanism, we need to phase out free allocation. So those are basic principles.
And is this something you've raised with Catherine Tai, or that she raised with you? Have you discussed it?
Indeed, we touched upon this. Well, at that time, proposal was still in preparation, and it's still, so to say, in finalization. But as it has been already outlined, what is important is that when presenting this proposal, we stick with our international obligations and we stick with the WTO rules. And WTO is not prohibiting countries or regions to take measures against climate change and so on. The question here is indeed non-discrimination, and that's what we're going to ensure.
But you see, especially for you as with the trade portfolio, you see that this offends a lot of trade partners. The Australian Trade Minister touched upon it as well earlier. Is it worth it? Obviously there are lots of questions and in a sense also concerns, and that's why we are assuring all partners that what we are preparing is going to be WTO compatible. But EU has been determined to lead from the front in the fight against climate change. We are going to be first continent to become climate neutral by 2050. So we see it as part of this bigger effort, which is very much needed. And of course, it's important that others are joining us in this effort. Okay, thank you. Maybe just one more, since we still have a couple of minutes. One more topic: the trade policy that we have outlined for the future. From the Commission, the idea of open strategic autonomy. How did that came up in your conversations with the US, and how similar is it to their trade approach?
Well, as regards this concept of open strategic autonomy, I would say it's a reflection of a shifting geopolitical landscape. So what this concept means that we remain committed to free and fair rules-based trade. We remain committed to multilateralism, but we are ready to act assertively if certain countries, if other partners do not play by the rules. So in a sense, we are going to act multilaterally whenever we can, but we are ready to act unilaterally whenever we must. So that's this basic concept of open strategic autonomy. And we see that also in other countries. There are discussions, for example, how to deal with the challenges posed by the socio-economic model of China. There are many other challenges, and also other countries are reflecting what approach best fits them in this context.
Okay, and specifically with the US, they have their Buy American strategy. Do you see parallels?
Well, Buy American, I would say it's somewhat different policy. It's basically about preference for domestic producers in public procurement. So there we are watching very closely that whatever is done is in line with the U.S. commitments in the WTO government procurement agreement, and also President Biden has stated publicly that as regards Buy American, U.S. will have to honor its international commitments. As regards the public procurement market in EU, in general, we have open public procurement markets. That way, I insist that also our partners are respecting their commitments, and in any case, the WTO government procurement agreement. But there are certain elements which we must watch. For example, now we are working on so-called foreign subsidies instrument, which addresses distortions in EU single market by state-subsidized third country providers.
Yeah. Okay, Mr. Lange, is this open strategic autonomy concept the right way to approach the post-pandemic trade system?
Yes, I think so. And we have really to reflect our situation, our economic situation in trade worldwide. So remember, 1 out of 7 working places are depending on trade. 1 out of 7. And 60% of our imports are used for export, so are really linked to global trade. And this is perhaps a big difference to other trading partners. So we have a really vital interest in a rules-based trading system. And looking around, we have a lot of protective measures, specifically during this pandemic. And this is not in our interest. I'm deeply convinced that trade is really stimulating growth, and if the conditions are set right, also sustainable growth. And this is our interest and our strategic goal. And therefore we need indeed open markets on a rules-based system, and we are looking around how to really give impact to this strategic autonomy. And of course we have to work on the WTO, so priority for a global rules system is there. We have also some bilateral agreements as a signal to overcome this protective thinking in some countries. And of course, in this case, we have also some differences with the United States. It's totally clear that our procurement legislation we are working on now to give equivalency. If there is a country excluding European companies from their public procurement, then of course we will do it in the same way. But on the United States, as Mr. Dombrovskis has mentioned, they have this Buy American Act. It's a different philosophy, and we have there different views how to give fair conditions for public procurement. We have to discuss this, but I think our interest in a rules-based global system is the right approach, and therefore I support this new thinking on a more geopolitical side by the Commission.
Mr. Gardner, how do you look at it? You've been following the Brussels trade strategy for a long time.
I agree. You know, we had a lot of debates, Bernd Lange and I, over public procurement, and we argued that the EU's public procurement market is open legally, but not so open de facto. And the EU was arguing the opposite of the United States. Those were skirmishes which led to nothing. And my point here is simply that this is an example of an area where we have to be realistic politically about the ability of the United States to move. It's going to respect its international commitments. That's the key point. But look, on the broader question, of course, Europe has an interest and should desire to defend and even project its interests around the world. I just wish it actually defended its own interests within the EU 27 more effectively sometimes. But as long as protection does not lead to protectionism, I think that we should be comfortable. I was disappointed that Commissioner Vestager felt it necessary to say that the rules about competition in digital were not anti-American. She's right. She's right. And I'm just disappointed because it's often a cheap shot that is launched against the EU. There are some member states who would like to turn some of these instruments against the United States into protectionism, but the European Commission does not. So I think our interests are in general aligned. And let's remember that a lot of things where we considered that the EU was going in a protectionist direction or anti-American were then subsequently adopted in the United States by a lot of titans of tech industry as being the right way to go. GDPR is just one of them, but there were other examples. So I don't buy into this general narrative. And I do think there are areas where even if we can't align, let's say on the digital agenda, we can reduce at least the disalignment.
Well, let's end on this positive note, for which I thank you. I'd like to thank the Executive Vice Presidents for coming here, Mr. Gardner and Mr. Lange for joining us virtually for this interesting debate. And I'd like to welcome you to stay tuned for our next session, an exclusive China Direct Spotlight discussion moderated by my colleague and Politico's EU-China correspondent, Stuart Lau, which will start at 10:35. Thank you.